This is Sandra Bland. She was born February 7, 1987, in Naperville, Illinois, just outside the city of Chicago. She was a college graduate, a member of the American workforce, and an avid philanthropist. She was known for her work as a part of the Black Lives Matter campaign, as well as her volunteer work for a senior citizens advocacy group. Sandra Bland was a daughter, a sister, an activist, and a friend. But most importantly, she was a human being, a citizen of the United States who was entitled to any and all rights granted to her by the United States Constitution. So why did Sandra Bland, a 28-year-old woman in seemingly perfect health, die in the custody of Texas police on July 13, 2015? Maybe she resisted arrest, or struck a cop, you might say. Or maybe she committed a violent crime and received the death penalty after a trial through the due process of law. Unfortunately, none of these were the case. Sandra Bland died in her jail cell after an unlawful arrest by a Texas police officer. The entirety of her arrest displays the police department's blatant disregard for the value of Bland's rights, as well as the value of her life. This is Brian Encina, a Texas state trooper. He pulled Bland over for failing to use a turn signal. In the dashcam footage, he takes Bland's license and registration back to his cruiser to run her information, a routine part of any traffic stop. When Encina returns, Bland is smoking a cigarette. He asks her politely to put it out. "You mind putting out your cigarette, please?" he asks, according to the police dashcam footage and testimony by Officer Encina. Bland inquires whether it is her legal obligation to put out her cigarette in her own vehicle per request of a law enforcement officer. Although impolite, a person over the age of 18 can smoke a cigarette in their own car in the presence of anyone, including a police officer. When she asks this question, Encina responds by saying, "Well, you can step out now," instead of actually answering her question. Bland refuses, as is her right. After her refusal, the officer states that he will, quote, light her up whilst drawing his taser, and that he will fire at her if she doesn't comply. She exits the vehicle at this point. He then arrests her, and when she asks why, Encina states it's because he's, quote, giving her a lawful order. During the entire encounter, he never gives Bland a reason for her arrest, which is not only against procedure, but is blatantly against the law. In addition to not giving her a reason for her arrest, Officer Encina didn't read Bland her Miranda rights. This includes her right to remain silent and her right to an attorney, and it is required by law for an arresting officer to read you these rights. Encina then uses excessive force to arrest Miss Bland. She can be heard yelling, "You're about to break my wrist," while he's cuffing her. The only reason for a police officer to use force during an arrest is if the arrestee were physically resistant, i.e. assaulting the officer or trying to run, or if he feared for his life. Use of force against a citizen should always be proportional to the circumstance. Bland is then taken to jail in Waller County, Texas, on false pretenses and by excessive force. She's charged with assault on an officer, which is clearly disproved by the dashcam footage. If the legitimacy of her arrest and conduct of the arresting officer weren't grounds for question and anger enough, Sandra Bland was found dead in her cell 3 days later. She was found hanging by a plastic trash bag affixed to a U-shaped metal hook in her cell. There was no activity outside her cell as indicated by security cameras for 90 minutes prior to her death. No security officers had checked on her since 6:30 that morning. She was pronounced dead at 9:16 a.m. on July 13, 2015. Her death, which was pronounced a suicide by the medical examiner, is a blatant example of unnecessary death by the hands of police. To be arrested for no reason and to watch a white man actively oppress you and get away with it would be grounds enough for anger and sadness. Bland, who according to her family's testimony had a history of depressive tendencies, was absolutely a victim in this situation. Many believe that there was foul play involved in Sandra's death. There's no way to prove this, but the fact that there's no first-hand account to prove otherwise is evidence enough that America is in need of a serious criminal justice reform. As a future and aspiring police officer and survivor of depression's potentially destructive grip, this instance deeply disturbs me. A citizen of the United States, no matter a human being, should never be treated like their rights are non-existent, especially by police officers. Police are constant participants in acts of neglect towards people of color. Officer Encina was placed on administrative duty following Sandra's death. A woman died as a result of this man's violation of due process, and he was put on desk duty. The prison guards violated policies in the lack of checks they made on her, which could have prevented her death. This leads me to my argument. I've carried this argument years prior to Sandra Bland's death, but it's just recently been worded in a way that has caught the public's eye and has been objected to scrutiny by society, and that statement is Black Lives Matter. If Sandra Bland had been white, Would the simple traffic stop have ended the way it did? And even if it had, would the police be held to a higher level of consequence because the victim had been perceived as an actual human being? Sandra Bland is, unfortunately, but one of many black victims whose deaths were swept under the rug because their assailants were cops. Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Romaine Bribson, Tamir Rice, Akai Curley, Trayvon Martin, Ezel Ford, Dante Parker, John Crawford, Tyree Woodson, Eric Garner, and the list goes on. How many more unarmed people of color have to be slain by police before we realize that our criminal justice system needs to be reformed? Black lives matter, and people need to realize this, especially the people who are sworn to protect these lives.